The tension surrounding Daphne Rose did not arrive suddenly like a thunderclap. It crept slowly into her life like a persistent shadow that refused to leave. In recent weeks she had begun to sense that something around her, something buried beneath layers of polite smiles and carefully rehearsed explanations, was not quite right. The first crack in her sense of normalcy appeared during her unsettling confrontation with Ivy. What had begun as a simple disagreement had quickly transformed into something darker and far more threatening. Ivy's voice had carried a tone that lingered in Daphne's mind long after the conversation ended. A tone that suggested she knew far more than she was willing to say. Ivy had not shouted or made obvious threats. Instead, she had spoken with calm precision, hinting that Daphne might regret digging into matters that did not concern her. That warning, delivered with a quiet smile, had sent a chill through Daphne that she could not shake. Daphne had spent most of her adult life believing she understood who she was and where she belonged. In the complicated orbit of Forrester creations, she had worked hard to build a life defined by determination and independence, refusing to rely on the powerful family networks that seemed to dominate the world around her. Yet Ivy's warning had awakened something unsettling inside her, an intuition that perhaps parts of her past had never been fully explained. It was not simply curiosity that drove her to search for answers. It was a deeper instinct, the kind that emerges when a person senses that the foundations of their identity might be built on hidden truths. That restless instinct eventually led Daphne back to the quiet corridors of Forrester Creations. Late one evening, the building, usually alive with the sounds of creative energy and constant activity, felt eerily still at that hour. The echo of her footsteps followed her down the hallway like a reminder that she was walking into something she might not be ready to face. She told herself that she was simply looking for old design references, something harmless that would justify her presence there. But beneath that excuse, she knew the real reason she had returned. Something inside her needed to confront the unease Ivy had planted in her mind. Inside one of the storage rooms where decades of old materials were kept, Daphne began opening boxes filled with forgotten documents, sketches, and fragments of the company's long creative history. The air smelled faintly of dust and fabric samples that had absorbed the passage of time. As she sifted through folders and envelopes, her mind wandered back to Ivy's words again and again. What had Ivy meant when she hinted that some truths were better left buried? The more Daphne thought about it, the more the warning felt less like advice and more like a calculated attempt to intimidate her into silence. She was about to give up when her hand brushed against something unexpected beneath a stack of faded fabric swatches. It was a small velvet box, worn at the edges as if it had been opened and closed many times over the years. The object seemed strangely out of place among the scattered design archives. Curious, Daphne lifted the box and opened it slowly. Inside lay a delicate necklace. The pendant was simple yet striking, a small piece of silver engraved with a single name. The engraving had softened slightly with age, but the letters were still clearly visible. Beneath the pendant rested a folded photograph tucked carefully into the lining of the box. Daphne felt a sudden tightening in her chest as she unfolded the picture. The photograph showed a much younger Brooke, standing in what looked like a hospital room. Her hair was shorter, her expression softer, almost fragile in a way Daphne had never seen before. In Brooke's arms was a newborn baby wrapped in a blanket. The baby's tiny face was turned slightly toward the camera. For several long seconds, Daphne could not move. Something about the image struck her with unsettling familiarity. She could not explain it logically, yet a strange recognition flickered at the edges of her mind. Her first instinct was disbelief. The idea that such a personal photograph could simply be forgotten among company archives made no sense. And yet there it was in her hands, accompanied by a necklace engraved with a name that made her pulse quicken. Daphne. The realization came slowly, like a distant echo gaining clarity. Her name. The air in the storage room suddenly felt heavier, as though the building itself were holding its breath. 1,000 questions rushed through Daphne's mind all at once. Why would a photograph of Brooke holding a newborn child be hidden among old company materials? Why was the necklace engraved with her name? And why had Ivy reacted so strongly when Daphne began asking questions about the past? The confusion and fear swirling inside her demanded answers. And there was only one person who could provide them. Without allowing herself time to second-guess the decision, Daphne left the storage room and headed directly toward Brooke's office. The walk down the hallway felt strangely surreal. Every step seemed louder than it should have been, echoing against the quiet walls. By the time she reached Brooke's door, her hands were trembling. She paused briefly, staring at the polished surface of the door as if it represented a boundary between the life she knew and something entirely different waiting on the other side. Then she pushed it open. Brooke looked up from her desk, clearly surprised by the sudden interruption. At first her expression softened with polite curiosity, but that calm demeanor disappeared the moment she saw the objects Daphne carried. The necklace, the photograph. Color drained from Brooke's face so quickly that it was almost shocking to witness. For a moment she seemed unable to breathe. Her gaze locked on the photograph as if it were a ghost from another lifetime. Daphne stepped forward slowly, placing the items on the desk between them. Her voice was steady, but beneath the calm surface there was a tremor she could not entirely control. She demanded an explanation. She wanted to know why Brooke appeared in the photograph with a newborn child and why the necklace bore her name. Brooke tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. The carefully composed confidence she usually carried had completely vanished. Instead, she looked like someone standing at the edge of a truth she had spent decades trying to keep buried. The silence stretched painfully between them. Finally, Brooke lowered herself into the chair behind her desk as if her strength had suddenly disappeared. Tears began to gather in her eyes, the weight of years of secrecy pressing down on her all at once. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled with emotion. She confessed that the child in the photograph was real. And that child was Daphne. The room seemed to tilt beneath Daphne's feet. For a moment she could not comprehend the meaning of the words she had just heard. The idea that Brooke, the woman she had known for years through business connections and distant familiarity, could actually be her biological mother felt impossible to process. Brooke continued speaking, her voice breaking as she explained the painful circumstances surrounding that long-hidden secret. Years ago, during a period of her life marked by emotional turmoil and uncertainty, she had given birth to a daughter she believed she could not raise. The decision to place the child for adoption had been one of the most agonizing choices she had ever made. She had told herself it was the only way to give the baby a stable future. But the guilt had never truly left her. Before Daphne could respond, another voice suddenly echoed from the doorway. Eric Logan. He stepped into the office quietly, his expression grave. It was clear from the look on his face that he had overheard the confession. With slow deliberation, he confirmed what Brooke had just revealed. For years he had been the only other person who knew the truth about the child Brooke had given up. He had carried the burden of that secret alongside her. The revelation hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. At that exact moment, Carter arrived outside the office, unaware of the emotional explosion unfolding inside. He had been searching for Daphne after their earlier conversation about their future together. They had been discussing the possibility of building a life side by side, imagining what happiness might look like beyond the chaos of the fashion world. Instead, he walked into a room where everything had just changed. The moment he understood the truth, that Brooke was Daphne's mother and that this secret had been hidden for years, his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief and finally to something deeper. Betrayal. Carter had always valued honesty above everything else. Learning that such a monumental truth had been concealed from him felt like the ground beneath his trust had suddenly collapsed. Worse still, the revelation arrived at the exact moment he had been imagining a future with Daphne built on transparency and mutual faith. Brooke watched his reaction with growing despair. In that moment she realized the devastating consequences her silence might bring. Not only could she lose Daphne, the daughter she had just rediscovered, but she might also fracture the fragile bond she had fought so hard to maintain with hope. Daphne stood frozen, overwhelmed by emotions she could barely name. The revelation that Brooke was her mother did not bring clarity. It brought a flood of questions, anger, and grief over the years of truth she had been denied. Without another word, she turned and ran from the office. Her footsteps echoed down the hallway as Brooke collapsed into tears behind her. Carter remained standing in stunned silence, unable to decide whether he should follow Daphne or confront the people who had hidden such a life-altering secret. Outside the office door, unseen by anyone inside, Ivy stood quietly in the shadows. She had heard everything. A slow, calculating smile spread across her face as she realized the power of the information she now possessed. In a world where secrets were the most valuable currency of all, she had just acquired one capable of reshaping the entire balance of power. And Ivy knew exactly how to use it. Daphne did not remember how she made it out of the building. The corridors of Forrester Creations blurred together as she moved through them like someone escaping a fire, her thoughts racing faster than her body could keep up. The words she had just heard continued echoing inside her mind with a surreal, almost cruel persistence. Brooke was her mother, the woman she had known for years as a powerful figure in the fashion world. Someone who carried an aura of authority and composure, was suddenly revealed to be the person who had given her life and then allowed her to grow up without ever knowing the truth. The revelation did not arrive as a warm reunion or an emotional miracle. Instead, it felt like a violent fracture in the foundation of everything Daphne believed about herself. Outside the building, the evening air felt cold against her face. Yet it did little to calm the storm inside her chest. Her entire identity now seemed unstable, as if someone had reached into the past and rewritten the story of her life without asking her permission. Memories from childhood began surfacing unexpectedly. Moments when she had wondered about her biological parents. Fleeting fantasies about who they might have been. What circumstances had led them to let her go? Those questions had always existed quietly at the edges of her life. But she had learned to accept the mystery. Now the mystery had been replaced by a truth so overwhelming that it felt almost impossible to carry. Back inside Brooke's office, the silence that followed Daphne's departure was thick with grief and shock. Brooke remained seated behind her desk, her hands trembling as she stared at the empty doorway where Daphne had disappeared. Years of secrecy had collapsed within a matter of minutes, and the emotional consequences were unfolding faster than she could comprehend. For decades she had convinced herself that keeping the truth hidden was an act of protection, that revealing it might only reopen wounds that had long since scarred over. Yet now she could see with painful clarity that silence had only postponed the inevitable reckoning. Carter still stood near the center of the room, his expression hard and distant. The man who had once looked at Brooke with easy respect now regarded her with a complicated mixture of anger and disappointment. The revelation had shaken him deeply, not only because of the hidden family connection but because of the deception surrounding it. For someone who valued honesty as the foundation of every meaningful relationship, learning that such a profound secret had been concealed felt like a betrayal that extended beyond Brooke alone. Eric remained near the doorway, his presence steady but heavy with regret. He had known for years that the truth might one day emerge in a painful way. Yet even he had underestimated how destructive that moment could be. Watching Brooke struggle with the consequences of a decision made long ago filled him with a quiet sorrow. He had believed he was helping her carry the burden of that secret, protecting both her and the child she had given away. Now it seemed possible that their silence had created more damage than honesty ever could have. Brooke finally lifted her eyes toward Carter, her voice fragile as she tried to explain what had happened all those years ago. She spoke about the fear that had consumed her during that period of her life, about the overwhelming uncertainty that had convinced her she was incapable of raising a child alone. She described the painful choice to place the baby for adoption, believing it was the only way to give that child a chance at a stable future. Every word she spoke felt like an attempt to hold onto a sense of moral justification that was now slipping through her fingers. But Carter did not interrupt with sympathy. He listened in silence, his thoughts drifting back to the conversation he and Daphne had shared earlier that day. Only hours before, they had been discussing plans for the future with a sense of cautious optimism. The idea of building a life together had felt tangible, something solid they could reach toward after years of personal struggles and complicated relationships. Now that future suddenly felt uncertain, overshadowed by a revelation neither of them had been prepared to face. The painful irony was impossible to ignore. Just as Carter had begun to believe that he and Daphne were finally stepping into a chapter defined by honesty and emotional clarity, the truth about her past had exploded into the open in the most chaotic way imaginable. Brooke rose slowly from her chair, the weight of desperation pushing her toward the door. She knew that every moment Daphne spent alone with her thoughts could deepen the emotional distance between them. If she allowed that distance to grow, she might lose the chance to build any kind of relationship with the daughter she had just rediscovered. Without waiting for another word from Carter or Eric, she hurried out of the office. The halls of Forrester Creations felt emptier now, the usual energy of the fashion house replaced by an unsettling quiet. Brooke moved quickly, her mind racing through memories she had spent years trying to forget. She remembered the hospital room where she had first held the newborn child in her arms, the tiny fingers wrapped around her own with a trust that had broken her heart. She remembered the moment she signed the adoption papers, convincing herself through tears that the decision was an act of love rather than abandonment. But love did not erase the consequences of that choice. Outside the building, Daphne had reached the parking lot, her breathing uneven as she tried to make sense of the storm of emotions surging through her. Anger mixed with grief, and beneath it all lay a strange, aching curiosity about the life she might have lived if Brooke had made a different decision all those years ago. Before she could reach her car, she heard footsteps behind her. Carter. He had followed her out into the night, his expression softer now but still clouded with conflict. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone struggling to balance compassion with the hurt he felt. He told Daphne that none of this changed who she was as a person. The revelation about Brooke might alter the narrative of her past, but it did not erase the strength and character she had built on her own. Yet even as he said those words, Carter knew the situation was more complicated than reassurance alone could solve. Daphne listened without speaking, her gaze fixed on the distant city lights beyond the parking lot. She appreciated Carter's attempt to support her, but the truth had opened a wound too deep to be healed by comfort alone. She needed time to understand what this revelation meant for her identity, her relationships, and the future she had been imagining only hours earlier. Back inside the building, unseen by either of them, Ivy remained hidden in the shadows of the hallway. She had not moved since overhearing the conversation in Brooke's office. The information she had gathered was far more valuable than she could have hoped for. A secret child, hidden for decades, connected directly to one of the most influential figures in the Forrester and Logan families. The implications were enormous. Ivy's mind worked quickly, calculating how this revelation might shift the delicate balance of power within the family. Secrets had always been the most dangerous weapons in their world, capable of dismantling reputations and reshaping alliances overnight. And now she possessed one powerful enough to send shockwaves through every corner of the Forrester empire. A slow, deliberate smile spread across her face as she stepped away from the doorway. For Ivy, the night had just become far more interesting, and the consequences of the truth that had finally surfaced were only beginning to unfold.